Hello everyone, I'm Master Denes Boros, and today I'm going to show you how you can win quickly with the Smith-Morra Gambit. Let's get into it. So here e4 c5, this is the Sicilian variation. d4, this is the beginning of the Morra, takes c3. So first off, you look at it and you feel, why does white really give up the pawn? And actually, for a couple of reasons. Well, for one, if white gets the chance, like to take on d4, following the chess principle of getting central control. So let's say if black goes knight f6, attacks our pawn, we would chase that knight away, knight d5, c takes d4, and white more or less would achieve something, and somewhat an advantage, because white would have two pawns in the middle, and black only has a lone knight there. So that is one of the plans. c3. What happens if black declines the offer? Well, if black declines, white can capture d6, c4, and in this scenario, white is just a little bit better, leading to a typical Maróczy type of structure where you control some of the most important squares that black could get in the center, therefore your position is just better. The other move, which is very interesting, whenever you're trying to play on the side, principally your opponent can try to break through in the middle. However, white can capture, queen takes, now if d takes, white can just capture, and white has a firm control of the center, plus development, so it's kind of getting the Morra Gambit advantage, plus you're not even down a pawn for it. So here, of course, black has to take. C takes d4, knight c6, knight f3, bishop g4. And at first blink, this looks very scary as there's pressure on the d-pawn, but white is just in time to go bishop e2. And after bishop f3, actually it is black who will suffer the consequences, because if black wants to take there, this bishop takes c6, and after b takes, there is queen takes d4, as black had to first reduce and get rid of that check. So therefore, the most critical way of playing against the Morra is to capture the pawn. And for that, I bring you two games. One of them is between Yvonne and Koblenz. Koblenz being a famous coach of the legendary world champion Michal Tal. And in fact, he's the one on the suffering side. But let's take a look what happens. D takes c3, knight takes c3, knight c6, knight f3, d6, bishop c4. So black is clearly up a pawn. However, for that pawn, white gets plenty of development and pressure on the most important squares in chess, that is the center. Also note that apart from posting that knight on c4, white is planning to castle short. Now, black must play e6 here, as happened in the game, as knight f6 runs into this beautiful sacrificial idea of e5. D takes c5 is a must, because if black takes with the knight first, there's knight takes c5, d takes c5, and bishop takes f7. Typical sacrifice, luring the king away, and after king takes f7, there's queen takes d8, and white is up a healthy lady. Therefore, black has to take with the pawn, queen takes d8, knight takes d8. Black obviously does not want to move the king because that would lose the right of castling. No more castling is available after this move. Also, there is this nasty knight jump on g5 and threats to fork the rook and king. So knight takes d8, but then here comes knight b5 with threats of coming with another fork, rook b8, knight takes e5, and as impossible it may seem, black is almost mated. So here black had to play e6. If bishop e6, unbelievable as it may, it's a checkmate, as the king has nowhere to run to, and this knight is kind of stuck and taking away the squares for the king on that square. So knight takes e5, e6, knight c7, king e7, bishop e3, knight c6, long castles. And it again seems like, hey, black is just winning a piece, but that's not so. Their bishop c5, it's checkmate. So that is why people play e6 first in this position instead of knight f6 because of the c5. This is not played that much, and instead e6 is played. Castles, obviously putting the king into safety and then putting pressure. So we didn't succeed to win the game in 7 to 10 moves, and probably we're not going to win it that early. However, we've got to notice what weaknesses black here, Grandmaster Koblenz, created. Biggest problem is the d6 pawn. So white's biggest plan here is to line up against it, put a bishop there, go queen e2, rook d1, and pressure down on the d file. Normally you see knight f6, but here black decided to play knight e7, which actually has a lot of issues with it. One of them being it basically crosses off and avoids the basic principle of chess, castling. While if black would play knight f6, bishop e7 castle, it would take only 3 moves for black to find shelter for the king, but after knight e7, knight g6, bishop e7 castles, it'll take a longer time. So white here notices that there is a discrepancy here and that he has an option of pinning that knight and goes bishop g5. A very strong move, especially if the knight is on e7, because if that knight cannot move, black's king will be stuck on e8 forever. And a king stuck in the middle of the board is never a good sign. h6, and h6, believe it or not, is already quite a big mistake, as white has this beautiful move of knight b5. It hits on d6, hits this potentially weak f7 pawn, as we've seen that before. That can often be the biggest culprit, and the reason for a loss, that square is just too weak. So here black played d5, and the reason why black didn't take on g5, because there's knight d6 check. Black of course cannot really take here, because it would lose the queen. And after king d7, the magical knight takes f7 shows up. It's also a discovered check, and not only does it hit the rook, it hits the queen, and after king c7, knight takes d8, white is winning. So good or bad, black had to go for d5. So if you're new to the Smith-Morra, you might be wondering, why are we sacrificing and why are we going forward with each and every move? Well, the reason we're going fast and furious with our moves is because our king has already castled and our counterpart has not. So the easiest way to win a game quickly in the Smith-Morra is to start launching and put pressure on the d6 pawn, as happens in this game. d5. Now, it is actually quite difficult to get close to your opponent's king unless you open it up. Therefore, Ney took on d5, which takes g5, d takes e6. And in fact here, white renews the same threat that we've seen in the previous example. So if black captures with the bishop, there's again knight d6 check, king d7, knight takes f7 with the same idea of winning the queen. Absolutely the same thing happens after f takes e6, check, knight f7, and winning the queen. And if queen takes d8, strangely enough, the solid rook d1 is strong because bishop e6, again, is checkmate on the board, as this king cannot move where his own pieces are at, otherwise king is smothered on e8. So therefore, black decided to create a luft instead on e7, e takes f7, king e7. Now, black is up a piece, but with everybody in the garage and not moving at all, you can tell that black is the one in trouble. Now, time is of essence here. So if black can manage to coordinate, white is going to lose. So white has to be as accurate as possible. And notices that this g5 pawn is kind of dangling and loose. Plays this very strong move, queen e1 check. And prepares this idea of queen e3 attacking the pawn. However, if black goes king d7, there's this rook d1 check idea, winning the queen and much more. So queen e1 happened, king f6, queen e3. So again, what Ney does perfectly well in this game is that he keeps bothering Koblenz, so it doesn't really give time for black to consolidate. So if bishop e6, then white would just take on e6 and its mate, of course. And if you go rook h5, even a simple rook e1 looks quite dangerous here, as this king is just awfully naked in the middle of the board. So Koblenz is trying to find some counterplay, but white has no reasons to get scared. One knight will not checkmate you. It's mostly a combination of a queen or knight that would be dangerous. h4. Another fearless move, taking away the defender of that knight. So g takes, there's just queen takes f4, and white's attack is breaking through. Bishop f5, queen g5 is checkmate. There's no escape squares for the king, and that square is protected by that bishop. It's essential that that bishop stations on c4. h4, bishop e6 takes, king f5, and this is a necessity, otherwise the e6 would fall. Takes, but white finds a way to say bye-bye to that king, and here black resigned. However, mate wasn't far enough, as after king takes g4, queen e6, king f3, check, king e2, check, king d2, rook d1 is checkmate. A beautiful game, and shows how to play when black does not castle in the Smith-Morra Gambit. Also look at those beautiful rooks, putting them both on the open files, talking about following chess principles. But what to do if your opponent actually is attempting to castle? For that, I have this game between the legendary world champion Michal Tal and Neybold. So let's take a look at this game. c3 takes, knight f3, bishop c4, 6 castles. And we talked about this idea of knight e7, but in that case bishop g5 is strong as per that previous game as mentioned. However, the critical line is knight f6, and as we talked about it, even though white is down a pawn, white has the initiative and a potential target on d6. Now, oftentimes you do not win that pawn on d6, but that added pressure counts as an initiative and an advantage. Just like in boxing, if you can push your opponent down, if you can keep working your opponent's defenses, subsequently your opponent is bound to crash under pressure. Queen e2, preparing this idea of a rook d1. So if you're wondering where your rooks belong in the Smith-Morra, clearly they belong on the d file and the c file. a6, rook d1. Very precise play by the legendary world champion Michal Tal. Queen c7, bishop f4. So as a motto, you want to pressure the d6 pawn and only go for bishop g5 plans if black goes knight g7 and knight g6. But in general, the bishop belongs to f4. Knight e5. Trying to desperately block off that diagonal. And here actually even Michal Tal makes an inaccurate decision, which is in some ways very surprising. He plays this simple bishop b3 move, which is not bad, but not the best. He had this spectacular sacrifice of bishop b5 check, takes, knight takes e5, d takes e5, knight takes b5, hitting the queen. And notice, these tactics usually work when the black king is still stuck in the center. Queen a5, bishop d2, chasing this queen. So if the queen would leave this diagonal, there is knight c7 check, and not only will the king have to move away from an important spot, but will also lose the rook in the process. So queen b6 has to be played. bishop e3, bishop c5, takes, rook c1, and look at that. A plan working like a charm. Queen b6, but in that case, knight c7, and white is winning the exchange and probably the game as well. So bishop b5 was kind of a rare mischance by Michal Tal, but bishop b3 still is in the concept. Normally you want to keep this bishop to pressure the e6 and f7 pawns. Oftentimes you can achieve that by marching up the f pawn with f4, f5. By the way, if you do not want to miss these tactical tricks like bishop b5 check, definitely check out the study section that I will provide at the end of this video, where I give you tactics and puzzles where you can get better at knowing what you need to know and how to win with the Smith-Morra variation. In any case, here Tal played the solid bishop b3, but he still has some aggressive ideas in mind, with the direction obviously being the f7 pawn and the e6 pawn. Bishop e7, rook c1. So these are the simple moves. They're all trying to press black down and put pressure on the queen. Now Nabul plays queen b8, which is correct, because if black decides to castle, there is this powerful move of knight d5. And after knight takes f3, queen takes f3, queen d8, white has this idea of knight takes c7, obviously taking the bishop. Bishop takes d6, winning the exchange as the queen is hanging. You must move, and bishop takes f8 leads to a beautiful position for white. So rook c8, queen b8, and you can already see that black's position is a little bit awkward. Most of black pieces are very passive and still in the garage, as you may say. Knight d4, a move that I really like. Here, Tal is planning to put pressure on the e6 pawn and also putting an extra piece in the middle of the board, ergo the center. Castles, bishop g3, preparing this idea of f4, f5, a beloved concept by Michal Tal and also a beloved concept by Bobby Fischer, as he loved using this method when he played his system and slash the Sozin system. Knight d7, f4. And this is actually one of the marks of the champions. They always go forward, and once they decide on a plan, they will always try to make sure that they execute it. And here Nabul actually got a little bit scared of e5. Possibly knight c5 would be better, obviously still with good play for white with an eventual e5 and f5. But e5 is a big mistake, as it opens up this bishop and gives control of that d5 square, which already gives a huge compensation for Tal. Knight f5, immediately attacking the d6 pawn and the e7 bishop. Rook e8, queen c4, d5, knight takes d5. Again, a little bit of a note. Notice that this rook is overloaded. It can't go back and defend this pawn because that would lose this bishop. Therefore, black is forced to give up the d pawn, and white has just a beautiful pressure on the f7 pawn. Bishop c5 check, king h1, rook e6. And it seems that everything is clear and nothing bad can happen, but in comes the tactical genius, the puzzle king, Michal Tal. Queen takes c5. Both as gambiting the queen away, but this one is a checkmate. So if knight takes c5, there's knight takes f6, rook takes f6, and rook d8 is mate, a classical back rank formation. However, the beauty of this sacrifice is the following. If you take here, this is still a back rank checkmate, as the g7 square is blocked off by this f5 knight. Even if black goes king f8, there's this check on rook d8, there's no escaping. Rook e8 is the only way to block it, and rook takes e8 is mate, which is kind of an original form of the back rank checkmate. The queen takes c5, knight takes d5, rook takes d5. And if you're not familiar with Michal Tal, he's a cheeky world champion. If he can play a cheeky move and offer the queen again, he will do so. Of course, knight takes c5 would still lead to this back rank mate. E takes f4, knight d7 check, king f8. Now as the king moved, there is kind of hope for this king to escape. So here, Tal changes plan, sacrifices the rook, takes here, knight c6 check, and here black resigned because of the eventual loss of the queen. And this kind of shows that some of these tactical patterns are very important, especially the back rank idea in the Smith-Morra Gambit. But what is more important is the feel for the initiative and the plan of going for the d6 pawn, and eventually you'll crash on through. Thank you so much for watching. Hope you enjoyed these two beautiful tactical games by Michal Tal and Ivone. And please leave a like if you enjoyed this lecture, and please comment below if you enjoyed it in general. By the way, I am going to give you some study material and puzzles, so go ahead and check it out later on if you have the time. Thank you so much for watching, and see you next time. Bye-bye.